I welcome you, everyone, to this webinar on alternative models of police service, specifically regarding how police agencies respond to people in crisis. This webinar is sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance Strategies for Policing Innovation Initiative and features presentations from 3 of our SPI sites that have dealt directly with these issues. I am pleased that we can offer this webinar at this important time in our history, with police agencies across the country taking fresh looks at their service models. I'm also very pleased to invite some opening remarks from our colleague at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Associate Deputy Director, Vince Davenport. Thank you, Vince.
Thanks, Chip, for the opportunity to be part of this presentation today. It's clearly one of the most important issues that we all face in the public safety sector. And I bring you greetings on behalf of the Acting BJA Director, Kristen Mahoney. I'm Vince Davenport. I'm the Associate Deputy Director for the Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Kate McNamee, who oversees the SPI program, among other programs. So in case you don't know, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about BJA. We're a component of the Department of Justice. We provide grants, training, technical assistance, and policy development services to state and local and tribal governments. And our mission is actually pretty simple. It's to reduce crime, combat victimization, and to support law enforcement. And today's webinar focuses on alternatives to traditional enforcement approaches when police respond to persons with mental health or substance abuse issues. And I will tell you that I'm sure most of you know that this has really been one of the most vexing issues for law enforcement, not just because of things that have happened in recent years, but really for decades now. And this is kind of where I insert my shameless plug for street cred amongst you real cops that are still out there doing the job. I spent many years on the job in the Kansas City area, in Kansas City, Kansas. And, there was a time when there were resources available for law enforcement where we could take people who were suffering from these types of crises, but they just all dried up. And it just became the purview of law enforcement for the most part. And, unfortunately for us and unfortunately for the victims who suffer from these illnesses, jail was oftentimes one of the only things that we could do to deal with a crisis, on a 911 call, for example. And as Chip alluded to, I think the events of last year really have brought this issue to the forefront, and it's been wrapped up in this whole idea of police reforms, which are needed for sure. And one thing I just want to frame out for our law enforcement partners out there in the field. I know there's a tendency sometimes to feel that law enforcement is getting beat up upon with these reform conversations, but I think this is really a win-win for law enforcement and I think for victims of substance abuse and mental illness. I think there's an opportunity for us to work together and to develop these multidisciplinary approaches with other social service and government entities that are out there to really help law enforcement to deal with these types of calls. And there are a lot of advantages. If we could figure out a way to address this issue more effectively, other than just through law enforcement and jails, I think that would result in maybe fewer calls for service, enhanced officer safety, if we have alternatives that involve de-escalation strategies as well. So today you're going to hear about 3 agencies and some of the approaches that they've developed to respond to people in crisis and the impacts on their agencies and their communities. We know that there are going to be some really important takeaways for you that you can take back to your respective agencies and to your communities. And so I want to say thank you to our guest speakers for sharing their stories. Special thanks to Chip and CNA for the terrific support that you provide for our SPI work. And most important, I want to say thanks to each of you who have made time in your busy schedules, undoubtedly, to be here today and for making this your cause. So thank you again for being here. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vince. It's good to hear from you today. And I have the added pleasure of handing the facilitation of this webinar over to our colleague, Hildy Sizo. So Hildy, can you please get us going?
Thank you, Chip. Hi, I'm Hildy Sizo, and I'm a senior advisor with CNA, and a longtime subject matter expert for SPI. Welcome to today's webinar on alternative models for responding to people in crisis. As Chip and Vince have just said, this is such a timely issue. And what we really need on this issue are new tools, more innovative models, greater collaboration with service providers, and just a willingness to try and do things differently. So fortunately, there are SPI sites that have been doing this for a number of years. 3 very different sites are with us today to present their experiences testing out some new and various models, but all with the same goal: to connect people who need help with the services that can meet their needs. So we'll hear first from the Roanoke SPI team, then the Sacramento SPI team, and finally from Providence, Rhode Island. So please feel free at any time to send questions through the chat function. We will be holding a Q&A at the very end of the webinar and using the questions that you've sent into the chat. So let me introduce our first presenters and we'll get started. Assistant Chief Jimmy Chapman with the Administrative Division of the Roanoke County Police Department, and Su Ming Yang, Associate Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society with George Mason University. So I'll turn this over to Jimmy.
Thanks, Hildy. Thanks, Chip. Myself and Dr. Yang certainly appreciate the opportunity to be able to discuss our project and look forward to any questions that may come from it. Just to be able to start off and put Roanoke on the map, we're located in the southwestern portion of Virginia, where Roanoke Valley is the largest metropolitan area in Southwest Virginia. The county includes the jurisdictions of the city of Roanoke, the city of Salem, and also the town of Vinton. We serve a population of just over 93,000. Our geographical area is approximately 250 square miles, and we divide that out into about 9 patrol districts. At full strength, we're 140 sworn officers, and I'm sure many other agencies that are on can attest to the difficulties right now in retaining, as well as bringing in new officers. In 2020, we lost approximately 20% of our staff and are trying to bring in and identify qualified applicants. Thinking about working at reduced capacities and having less resources out there certainly creates some challenges around interactions with individuals who are suffering or experiencing a mental health crisis or have a mental illness. So unlike urban communities, rural communities generally have low crime rates. However, mental health calls for service continue to be a concern. And so the data that I'm providing to you is sourced from our 2010-2016 calls for service. And annually, we would see approximately 550 mental health related calls for service, roughly 2% of our total call volume. However, when we looked at the average amount of time that these calls would take, it was approximately 4 hours. And then if you compare that to any other call within the county, it's about 40 to 50 minutes is what a normal call would take an officer. So you certainly could see, and other agencies here could certainly attest to the disproportionate amount of time that police do spend on these types of calls. The other piece of data that we wanted to look at was the mental health, any use of force incidents. And so about 24% of our use of force within this 2010-2016 involved the subject that either the officer believed was in a mental health crisis or believed they had a mental illness. And so from that data and really the concern over these interactions, we thought, well, how could we improve this? And we were fortunate enough to be awarded a BGA SPI grant, and we built a partnership around that. First identifying a local service provider, mental health service provider, which was Intercept Youth Services. And Intercept had already pre-established a 24/7 hotline that would connect an individual in crisis to services, and that service specifically was titled Crisis One. So with our local service provider identified, we reached out to the Center at Evidence-Based Crime and Policy at George Mason University to assist us with the research aspect of this. So we created a randomized control trial to put in experimental context to figure out how we could enhance police response to people with mental illness. So the goals of the project were four that we were trying to achieve. And so first and foremost, we wanted to improve safety of officers, the citizens, and the community at large. We also wanted to try to figure out how could we reduce the amount of time officers would spend responding to mental health calls, as well as how could we reduce the repeated calls for service from those frequent flyers that many of our agencies have, as well as could any of these interventions help reduce use of force incidents. So once we've identified the problem, we have the goals in place. Is okay, so what does this look like? What did our mobile crisis team look like? So as I stated earlier, this is a randomized control trial. We randomized treatment and control between our 3 patrol shifts. And so when an officer would respond to a call for service, either it was already pre-identified as a mental health call for service, or once on scene, they realized the person was in crisis or there was a mental health component. They would follow the standard operating procedures. So all of our officers are trained in 40 hours of CIT, and they would utilize their skills there to de-escalate and gain control of the situation. If the officer was not going to take the person into emergency custody, which in those environments typically involves the person with the knife to their wrist. So we could exclude that, and the officer, there wasn't a reason to arrest. This treatment was for the individual that falls between those two spectrums, that someone who's in crisis, and we need to de-escalate and try to get them some services to help them through this problem. The officer would ask that individual, would you like some help? And I could get a clinician here to provide some assistance. Assuming the person would agree to this, we contact crisis 1, and a clinician would respond to the scene. This could be in a person's living room, at a county park, or at your local Walmart parking lot. Wherever it was, they were able to do that. Our contract with them was we would give them an hour to respond. However, typically response times fell within the 20 to 30 minutes. And once on scene, officers would just simply create a soft handoff between them and the clinician. And as long as the clinician and the officer both felt that the scene was safe, the officer could leave. If for any reason the officer or the clinician felt uncomfortable or there were some additional safety concerns, the officer would remain on scene. And once on scene, the clinician could begin to immediately provide or at least introduce some treatment options for the individual. And so one of the things that gives some overview of what Crisis 1 and the mobile crisis team or the clinician was able to provide, well, first and foremost, they could provide some additional de-escalation when needed, and certainly to create some rapport with the individual was important. They had the ability to refer out to additional services within the Intercept organization, and they could also make recommendations for hospitalization, such as an emergency custody order or a temporary detention order. In these kind of cases was when an individual may not feel comfortable speaking to the officer or did not disclose suicide ideations or a plan around suicide to the officer, but felt more comfortable doing this to the clinician. So they could make the recommendation for hospitalization. And as well, on a much more rare occasion, but they could also provide transport to the local hospital or to another service provider when applicable. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Su-Ming Yang.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. So just a little bit quick overview of what our randomization result looked like. So totally, we were able to randomize 2,800 police shifts. So roughly 50% went to treatment shift, the other 50% were control shift. So out of the whole process, so we were able to consent like a 93 participant to join the treatment program, and 47 individuals agreed to be on the control group. So one of the important goals, like Jimmy described earlier, we want to know that whether there's any difference between the treatment and the control subject, specifically whether when they receive this crisis treatment, are they going to fare better or not? So we compare the treatment and control group before, and during, and after the treatment intervention. So unfortunately, we did not find significant differences between the treatment and control subject during the treatment program and the post-intervention. So we wanted to know more about the treatment subject and specifically to understand what was going on. So to our surprise, we learned out of a total treatment participant, about 1/3, like 30% of them, actually only 30% of them actually receive and complete some treatment program, and about 60% of them decline or like it just dropped out of the treatment program. And that was surprising to learn that we thought like a providing treatment program that will fit their need would be some like an important incentive. So and also when we try to compare those people who actually receive and complete some treatment program versus people who decline treatment program, we found interesting differences before the intervention. And the people who consent and complete treatment tended to be the frequent flyer or the high utilizer of the police services. And you can see on the blue column, and the number of police contact among those people were way higher than the red column, which represent the cases, the police contact of the people who decline services or people who drop out services. But so when we want to understand, okay, were there any benefit for this treatment completion? So we try to understand the reduction, or I should say changes in terms of police contact before and after intervention for people who complete treatment, for people who decline treatment, and for the control subject. So if you see the red bar for both general calls for service and mental health services, you can see people who actually complete some treatment, they actually experience significant reduction in terms of police contact post-intervention compared to pre-intervention. Remember, they were high utilizers, so you see the big decline. But for people who decline or drop out of treatment, in the middle of the red bar, you see like actually an increase in the number of police contact post-treatment compared to the pre-intervention, and which is very similar to what has been experienced by the control subject. And we also obviously experienced some difficulty in terms of program evaluation processes. Specifically, probably not too many of you are surprised that we could not really get many responses from control subject. Remember, those people were like people in mental health crisis or having some mental health disorder. So some of them were transient, paranoid, and skeptical to talk to us. And sometimes the number have been disconnected or they change the number, we just can't get hold of them. We try to be creative. We created like a Facebook page, try to recruit subject. We got a cell phone with a Rhode area code, or we just try to be persistent in calling or text messaging and whatnot. The success on that part was pretty limited, unfortunately. So we had to just go to find different like outcome for the evaluation process. So we ended up using the police calls for service as official data to evaluate our outcome. And like the previous slide showed, the majority of treatment participants did not complete the prescribed treatment procedure. That's to our surprise. And another thing we noticed during the process is the randomization by police shift could actually lead to some cross-contamination. Specifically, sometimes officers, despite the fact they were briefed on whether this is treatment versus control shift before they at the roll call, sometimes they forgot, sometimes they just sort of like still try to compensate the fact they were actually assigned to the control shift. So they might actually do things a little bit differently to get around that. So so that was the realization that we learned from the police survey and also from the focus group. So recently we have been awarded an NIJ grant working with Rhode area on another mental health project. So in this new project, so we plan on using the hotspot approach as opposed to like randomization by the police shift, try to avoid this contamination problem. And I'm going to turn it back to Jimmy so he can share some of the lessons learned from our project.
Thanks, Yiming. Yeah, so we'll start off with just, what made the collaboration work. And, first and foremost, I believe everyone who came to the table here had a common goal. And that was really to try to determine how we could improve police response to individuals who are in a mental health crisis or experiencing a mental illness. So those are, right from the get-go, that was a major, major piece of this. The other thing is really having support from our leadership at the top of the organization. to be able to prioritize this project. Certainly a time-consuming project that pulled staff in a variety of different ways, and the chief having the ability and allowing the flexibility for staff to work on this project, as well as taking opportunities to discuss the project with his bosses, our board of supervisors, and putting it out for public consumption at our neighborhood watch meetings and business group meetings and that sort of things. And the other thing that really worked here was just a professionalism, just a general respect of each individual partner, that these folks are all subject matter experts that came to the table, and they all bring a different level of knowledge and expertise. And so to just be able to respect what their positions and where they're coming from. As with any relationship, I think open communication goes without saying, but certainly played a part in what made our collaboration work. We had weekly meetings for the project team to go through and discuss any issues and challenges. However, the more critical issues that did come up didn't wait to the weekly meetings. We had constant dialogue throughout the week or between these meetings when it was necessary to handle something immediately. And that was very useful and helpful. And then also this just having a willingness to have some tough conversations and just understanding like things are just not going to work. Clearly, when we just know like some things in the field are just not going to be convenient for an officer to do, and being able to just step up and say that's just not going to work and we're going to have to figure out a way to work around it. And with that being said, it's really about having an approach of let's be oriented or focused around solving the problem versus blame assigning. So that was a major focus and helpful for our kept our communication going and really helped this project move along. As well as is having some inputs from the field. So Dr. Yang and her colleague, Dr. Gill, came and did some ride-alongs with our officers. Dr. Yang actually had an opportunity to see and meet one of our high utilizers and really to see firsthand what the complications that officers deal with in the field and the limited resources that really are available on some of these calls. As well as the clinicians did ride-alongs just to get a feel for the officers and how they do their job and things that they're experiencing. Additionally, conducting surveys and focus groups throughout the project with officers and clinicians just to get some feedback and to hear and also to update them on how things were going. Of course, nothing, a lot of positive on that slide, and we can talk about more of the complicated issues here. And, first and foremost, this probably goes back to the need for clear communication is that in training, we thought we did a fantastic job training all of our patrol staff on the procedures for this project. And what we learned is that what's said and what is heard is often two different things. And so in the field, training scenarios and what's in the field are often different, and the field is much more complex and a little bit and is much more nuanced. And so this played out, and we had to make several adjustments on the fly. The other thing is that there was quite a bit of frustration on the officers about the randomization process, and specifically, this just really looked like if an officer was on a control shift, they knew that if the individual had called at a different time or on a different date, that this treatment was available. And so that was a bit frustrating to them, but we just had to reinforce to them that to maintain the integrity of the project, they would just need to follow the control shift procedures, and also to help them sort of somewhat justify this ethical issue that they were facing is that at the conclusion of our randomized control trial, we would come back to those individuals in the control shift and offer them treatment. So some of the solutions that we came up was just more training, more communication. We established a monthly newsletter, pushing out small quick hit trainings through email, and just some visits at lineup and constant discussions at our staff meetings. On the clinical side, some of the experiences that we had or challenges that we faced was individuals who were intoxicated or having dementia. These were a bit of a problem. So who sort of decides? Dementia sometimes can be clear, but intoxication puts a question in the officer. Is this somebody who's intoxicated and acting out as if it appears to be a mental health crisis, or is it reversed? And so these co-occurring disorders sometimes can be very complex to decipher in the field, and that was a bit challenging also for the clinicians. And then also just this, the attrition and dropouts of partitions became quite a bit challenging as well. And so how do you keep folks engaged in treatment? And then just to make some recommendations, some quick takeaways in case there's any agencies that are thinking about partnering with a local service provider in their community. We certainly feel that there's some positive results that can come from this. certainly from one of the things that we gained anecdotally and through some of the feedback from officers in the surveys, as well as in the focus groups, is that officers feel a sense of satisfaction is being able to have just an additional tool in their toolbox to be able to connect a person to services. Often officers go to these calls, they provide some sort of quick intervention, de-escalate, and then they're moving on, knowing that they're likely to come back. So this was an opportunity to give them just another tool. Also is really spend some time and look in your community and ask, like, where are the potential partners that could help you in this? And if you have some, that's, start those conversations early and often. Also, as I said earlier, leadership needs to be in place for the program to be successful, as having it from the top down, as well as how can departments expand their mental health training. The CIT program traditionally runs in a 40-hour format, realizing the limited resources right now and pulling people away for a week-long training can be difficult. Mental health first aid is about an 8-hour block of instruction, and is something as it provides officers with just a little bit additional resources and information on how to handle these types of calls. As well as if we could think about also who are our high utilizers and can we target treatment specifically to them with some local service providers. We feel like there may be some ability to reduce repeat calls for service. And then on the clinical side is for those service providers that are in your communities, really, what do they have available? And one of the things here is really if they have the ability to either serve internally or to refer out is for substance abuse treatment. Is having some options in place already that connect an individual to those substance abuse treatments can be very, very beneficial. We feel that was an important takeaway from our project. And also incorporating someone on care coordination to help with those attritions and dropouts. It's like, how do you keep people involved in the treatment and keep them going? Because we did learn that once somebody was in the treatment and maintained the treatment, we could see a reduction in the calls for service. And lastly, is there's just some needs around, how do we get some rigorous empirical evidence that could help secure external funding for the sustainability of the program? Unfortunately, in the state of Virginia, crisis is not really covered by private insurance. Medicaid does provide it. And so there's some, how do we leverage our evidence and maybe to either drive legislation or to get insurance companies to consider coverage around these types of issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roanoke team. We appreciate your insights and your presentation. Let's move to our next set of presenters who come from the Sacramento SPI. We have Sergeant Christy Lynn, the Homeless Outreach Team Supervisor within the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, and Arturo Biaggi, Associate Professor in the Division of Social Work at California State University, Sacramento. So I'll turn this over to Christy.
Well, I think I'll get started. I'm Arturo Biaggi. I'm Associate Professor of Social Work here at Sacramento State, and my colleague, Sergeant Christy Lynn, is, as was discussed, was head of the Homeless Outreach Team. And we just want to first of all thank SPI and CNA for the support and the 3 years of ongoing technical support as we launched this project, which was really a collaboration between the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, a social service provider called Sacramento Steps Forward, and Sacramento State, where I currently teach. So today, to give you a kind of outline of what we're going to discuss, I find that when I teach college courses, my students prefer when I have a roadmap of where I'm going, so you know when I'm ending at least. We're going to start out by just talking a little bit about the context of the SPI grant that we applied for and received, about the issue of homelessness here in Sacramento County, and the intervention that we planned and tried to implement. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings of the evaluation, both the process evaluation in terms of implementation, but also the impacts that we discovered. And then we'll kind of conclude talking a little bit about lessons learned.
So just to give you a little bit of background about Sacramento County, the Sacramento Sheriff's Office has 1,595 sworn deputies with about 643 professional staff. And we serve approximately 600,000 residents within that area. There are 3 overall patrol divisions for the county that include about 8 different calls for service divisions in that. And then we also provide contract services for the local dam, the airport, and then we have 1 contract city that we provide law enforcement services for as well.
when we got together to apply for the grant, you may know that California is experiencing kind of a precipitous increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness. And unfortunately, the situation has only gotten worse probably in the last 5 years. The slide comes from the 2019 point in time count, which we also helped coordinate, where we found that approximately 5,500 individuals are experiencing homelessness on any single night, which is a pretty dramatic increase from the previous 2 years. And what was kind of troubling about these statistics is, one, the two fastest growing groups of homelessness seems to be in the county, families with children and folks over the age of 55. And per capita, Sacramento has around 36 per 10,000 individuals experiencing homelessness each night, which is about average for the state of California, but is actually twice the per capita rate for the United States. So we'll go to the next slide. When we applied for the grant, the Sheriff's Department approached me with this idea about how they wanted to change their approach to how they were responding to the approximately 1,000 calls they were getting from community members just related to homelessness. And they wanted to kind of try to explore if they can go away from a strictly enforcement model to what they were describing as a service and community approach with homeless. And particularly, could they use the sheriff's deputies to do connecting individuals to services and supports? And knowing that law enforcement can't be the solution to homelessness, can they nonetheless work with the community on the various solutions to homelessness, particularly if we're not going to solve homelessness necessarily, but how can we at least improve the response to homelessness? So in the proposal, we kind of discussed how the intervention was going to have two main components. One, we were going to assess trends in the calls for services in the 4th District and look for particularly hotspot areas where community members are making many calls related to homelessness, and kind of deploy specific outreach teams combined with a social worker and law enforcement to basically patrol these hotspot areas and move on as new hotspots emerge. And the second component was really to do this, what we were calling service and community-oriented policing. So the outreach team was primarily trying to move away from just using enforcement tactics, but instead we're trying to establish relationships with the individuals that they encountered, doing service referrals, but also working with other agencies in the community that are addressing homelessness, and figure out ways that the sheriff's departments could establish relationships and kind of pilot initiatives beyond just the outreach team.
So we have two actually separate teams that deal with homeless. We have the SPI team, which got off and running in January, I believe, 2017. And with the HOT team, they specifically looked for, because it was a part-time team, retired annuitants that had experience in investigative experience. And the reason for that was because it does require out-of-the-box thinking to make these long-term solutions with problems that have been going on for so long. They're complex problems, and they require more than the typical Band-Aid that patrol is able to give on a daily basis. And we also have the homeless outreach team that was funded with money from the Board of Supervisors due to the high call volume of calls that we are getting regarding homeless. They funded 10 bodies, which included 8 patrol officers in the field in the county, and then 2 at work release, which supervised groups of inmates to actually do the cleanings when we would do camp removals or areas that homeless had moved out of that needed to be clean. It also included 1 supervisor position. So the way that we get calls for service or from the community are from email, phone calls, other complaints coming in from other county agencies, whether it's Department of Transportation, the Board of Supervisors, or the like. And then we respond to homeless calls from patrol units. So if patrol is out there and they come across someone who's either looking for services, they're finally ready to take that step, they're looking to see what they may qualify for, or it's just something that requires more than what patrol can handle, they can hashtag it to one of our 3 homeless outreach emails that we have, depending on what division it's in. And those go directly to our email, and then we can address those as we come back on shift. Definitely proactive patrols. If they're driving and see a homeless individual, they can go make that contact. We try to make as many contacts as possible to build that trust and relationship up. And then engaging homeless to provide resource and outreach. What services will they qualify for? What's something out there they may not have thought of? and to really get them to the point where they're ready to accept those services. As HOT team member, they do respond to calls for service as they come out, but that's more for patrol to handle, and we really try to go to the ones where we're going to make a long-term change. The next slide, please. So how do we accomplish our mission? Ongoing personal contact with homeless to increase trust and make referrals to service providers. We know that none of these are going to happen with the first contact. It really takes ongoing contacts with homeless, ongoing relationship building to build that trust so they know that we're out there service first, not doing enforcement on the front end, but really to try to get them to accept services. Many of them know our names, they know our names, and we're just waiting for that time when they are ready to take that opportunity to get that first step. Developing the agency partnerships is really important to us and really important to what we do. We have upwards of 50 different service providers that we collaborate with, everything from Paul Mitchell for haircuts, California Department of Motor Vehicles. We have that we can hand out ID vouchers for, various housing and shelter providers, and then medical organizations that can come out and provide services. We've given rides to the medical appointments and set them up appointments, and then drug and alcohol treatment programs. We just came online with 2 more of those drug and alcohol treatment programs, and we're testing them out for them and starting to utilize them as well. There's just constantly new programs out there. And so we try to make sure that we're plugged into them and have their direct contact, and they use us as well when they're either looking for someone whose name comes up or they're looking to see if a new program is going to work. We work very closely with them also. And then of course, there's an enforcement piece. There has to be an enforcement piece, and there is enforcement that needs to take place sometimes when dealing with the homeless, whether it's trespassing or public intoxication. We do also have to have that, but because of our relationships, when we have to go in there with enforcement, it usually goes over quite well, and we get their participation rather easily. So we developed a 3 E's when we started this program. It's education, encouragement, enforcement. Of course, educating individuals on the services that are available, and just teaching them that all the services that are out there. We have many people that have no idea or are so overwhelmed by all those service providers, they just don't know which direction to go. So we provide them, we're the conduit for them between the homeless and the outreach services, and can tell them what they may qualify for, set them up the appointments, and then we've taken them to appointments quite often. And then building the encouragement, really convincing them that this is the next best step to take, and it may take a while, but we keep going out there and offering the services and trying to get them to that place where they're ready to change their mind and change their situation. And of course, again, the enforcement part, taking that enforcement action when it's necessary. So a quick success story, Angela and Anthony, they're a family with 3 children, homeless for 2 years, living in a vehicle or a tent, just kind of depending. We referred them to Deputy Wright. You can see there in a picture. He's a retired annuitant that came back to us from detectives. And he was one of the first officers that took this position. So he formed great relationships with a lot of the service providers and worked with Sacramento Steps Forward to locate a home for the family. They moved into the home with their children in 2018. And then we also have relationships with Deseret Industries, which is like a Goodwill if you're not familiar. And we were able to provide them with enough things to get them up and running. So bedding, a bed, vacuum, that kind of stuff that they may need. And that's really the ultimate goal, is to get people off the street into housing.
So I'll talk a little bit about some of our evaluation findings, primarily of the SPI 3-person outreach team. So with respect to the aspect of the service-oriented policing model, we found generally strong evidence that the team implemented this as planned. The outreach team were on patrol 10 to 15 days a month. However, we had some mixed evidence that the team stayed within the hotspots. So we kind of discussed in our report that one of the challenges in implementation is that the team didn't really consistently stay within the hotspot areas, and that they would often go to other areas, particularly if they got a call from a patrol that was working in a different part of the county. So only 7 days per month were the team was actually working within the targeted areas on average. They made approximately 2,000 contacts with 1,200 individuals over the 35 months of the grant, so about 62 contacts per month. And we saw really almost no use of enforcement by the SPI team. There were only 4 incidents in which an enforcement activity was noted in terms of a citation. So It was only logged 0.5% of the dispatches. Approximately 30% of the individuals had multiple contacts with the team. So there was, an initial contact, and then there was this work that Sergeant Lynn was talking about establishing a relationship and then figuring out how to help these individuals, which can't always happen within the context of a single encounter. Ultimately, approximately 200 individuals recovered from homelessness and transitioned into some form of housing through some type of assistance by the Sheriff's Department. One of the interesting things we found is that even though these 200 individuals, were assisted by the Sheriff's Department, only about 10% or 20 of those individuals actually were referred to the formal system that is supposed to kind of house these individuals, something called the coordinated entry system that I could talk about later. We thought that would be a much more responsive system than it turned out to be. And instead, the deputies found themselves kind of directly working with service providers, or sometimes even working with apartment complexes and establishing relationships about how to help people maintain their housing. One of the things we highlight in the report is that the intervention discussed all this, the essence of kind of building a community response, and we feel that this was probably the clearest success of the project. That, as Sergeant Lynn discussed, that nearly 50 service providers collaborated with the Sheriff's Department over the 3 years with a variety of different across different service sectors, whether we're talking about health or substance abuse or formal housing institutions. An example of this is what the Sheriff's Department organized a couple times during the grant were these HOPE events, the Homeless Outreach Partnership events, in which with minimal investment and just some logistics that the Sheriff's Department embarked on, they were able to kind of coordinate these service fairs with 30 to 40 different service providers coming to one central location on a weekend, often a church parking lot, and then inviting individuals who are experiencing homelessness in the community to come to this area. And so when I observed these events, anywhere from 80 to 100 individuals would come in, and they could be connected with a variety of services, kind of a one-stop shop kind of model, and which I thought was pretty innovative. And we talked with a lot of different service providers who actually appreciated this kind of coordination by the Sacramento Sheriff's Department. In terms of other outcomes that we were tracking, we actually saw mixed evidence of decreased community concerns, that is, calls for service. During the first 2 years of the project, we did see a reduction in the number of calls related to homelessness in the hotspots. So for instance, in the first year, we saw a 21% reduction compared to the previous year. We didn't see calls get pushed to areas outside of the hotspots, which we were kind of tracking as well, thinking that one way that law enforcement could kind of reduce calls by essentially pushing individuals to other areas, but we didn't really see any evidence of that. Whereas the rest of the county was seeing kind of an increase in the number of calls, so about a 15% net increase from the prior year. In phase 2, we saw also a notable decline of about 37% in the calls in the hot areas, and also 21% reduction in calls around the hotspots. But that was also a year in which we saw a pretty substantial decrease in the number of calls that the Sheriff's Department was receiving in year 2 related to homeless calls. This could be in part because they were also developing an app and other ways that community members could contact the Sheriff's Department. So we don't know if this is kind of a data quality issue. And in phase 3, things got really messy with the hotspots and officers not spending time there, that we kind of abandoned the analysis in the 3rd phase. The other outcomes we tracked in terms of reduction in crime, we saw quality of life crimes decrease in the hotspots, but for other types of crimes, we didn't really see any notable decreases. We also saw mixed evidence of changed police culture. In the proposal was discussed that the intervention was to establish this or solidify this community response to homelessness, but also change the culture of how the Sheriff's Department was interacting with individuals experiencing homelessness. While SPI, I think, is a clear demonstration of that, an outgrowth of the SPI grant really was this expanded patrol team that was also called the HOT team. That we saw that we didn't really track as part of the evaluation, but we did track their number of enforcement tactics. And even though we saw that this new patrol team had some similar philosophies, and we're engaging with individuals experiencing homelessness more than other teams, we didn't really see a reduction in the use of enforcement. In fact, we saw an increase in the use of enforcement, particularly around ticketing. We didn't see an increase in arrests, but we saw this as mixed evidence. So this is an area that we cited in the report that still needs to be evaluated and we think can be improved upon. So in the next slide, I kind of just talk a little bit some of the conclusions, the lessons learned, and reflections from the intervention. And maybe I'll go through a couple and then Sergeant Len can give her perspective. But one of the things we discuss in the report is that for other agencies thinking about doing this type of model, you know, it was really successful in terms of this integration with a lot of different service providers. But I will say that there is a learning curve to understanding the service system, and that in the United States, social services are pretty siloed. People who provide medical services are distinct from people who provide social services, who provide housing services. And there's also a confusion about whether services are being sponsored by the county or the city. So there's different jurisdictions. And while I think the deputies did a good job overall, I would say the first 2 years, there was a lot of learning about which providers actually could provide the right assistance at a timely fashion. Another thing that we learned is that it was clear, you know, we rode along with the outreach team throughout these 3 years. And it's very clear that the social worker and law enforcement have different perspectives on situations. And law enforcement is, I would say, much more crisis oriented and action oriented, and they want to solve issues today and deal with the situation. Whereas social workers are much more, let's slow down, let's assess the situation. And these orientations conflicted oftentimes, but we actually saw that as kind of a useful thing. Sometimes we actually saw social workers being a little bit speedier in their response to certain situations. And we saw the officers kind of learn to de-escalate some situations as opposed to kind of rushing things, which I think is a good thing. It's a hard thing to capture quantitatively, but qualitatively, we saw lots of interesting interactions between the deputies and the social workers. We're not saying that law enforcement need to become social workers and social workers need to be law enforcement, but we're saying that dialogue, that creating this exchange is a useful thing. I think the last two things I will say is that experience, if you're going to do this kind of intervention, I think selecting officers who have a lot of experience, particularly detective experience, was very useful. But also I think they identified individuals who are also willing to learn and learn new things, which I think is actually a really important thing. When they told me that they were bringing back folks who had, 30, 40 years of law enforcement experience, I was a little bit nervous because would they be able to learn new things or would they be kind of stuck in their ways? But at least the deputies that I interacted with, they're actually quite excited to learn new things, which I think made the intervention more successful. That being said, I do think the team needs more training and on case management and de-escalation techniques. And I think they need to bring in a social worker much more for that than training the officers themselves. I think there could be an embedded social worker that's full-time, not just part-time, or two social workers. So I'm also teaching a school of social work, so I'm a little bit biased on that last comment. But I'll let Sergeant Lynn reflect on any of the things that I've said about lessons learned.
Yeah, bringing in a social worker is something that we have actually been looking at for several years, and it's just not there in the funding. But I agree with Professor Bayaki. That's something we could definitely benefit from, and I know other surrounding agencies have benefited from also. So just kind of give my wrap up for lessons learned. It is a big learning curve, especially coming from patrol, coming over and trying to work with all these outside agencies. Build the trust between the agency as well, between the service providers, that they're trusting that we're going out there with a service first kind of mission and not law enforcement. It takes a while to build that relationship. And thankfully we have a great relationship with all those providers now, but it does take some time. And then also, if you're going to do one of these programs, it's going to take a while. Trust the process. It takes time to build those relationships with law enforcement and providers. Law enforcement, we're used to going out there as fast as we can, solve the problem, move on to the next one, put that Band-Aid on. And this just isn't one of those things. We have to take a step back and know that every contact is an opportunity to build a relationship and that it's going to take some time. We may go out there 4 or 5 times before somebody's ready to take that step. But ultimately the goal is to get the homeless off the street into housing or drug and alcohol treatment, getting jobs and so on. But it does take time and you just have to trust that part of it.
Thank you very much, Sacramento team. We really appreciate your perspectives and insights. Let's move to our third site, Providence, Rhode Island. We have with us Paul Zenowitz, Detective Sergeant with the Providence Police Department, Officer Mark DeCecco with the Providence Police Department, Stephanie Manzi, Professor of Criminal Justice at Roger Williams University, and Jackie Mancini-Gear, Director of Acute Care with the Providence Center. So I'll turn it over to the team.
Thank you, Hildy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to bring the perspective of the SPI grant from Providence, Rhode Island. Just to give you a little background on us as the key partners. Providence Police Department was the key grant holder, and they are authorized to have a full staff of 494 officers, sworn members. And like so many of the other departments, they are currently working below capacity at 443 sworn officers. So all of these agencies should be commended for doing more with fewer officers, because we know that can be very straining. They had a very active role in going out with our clinicians, and we'll explain that process in just a couple of minutes. And they also helped collect with our data collection and the officers. There were several officers that were assigned to this SPI grant, and they went out with the clinicians. They did this in addition to their regular duties. So they typically came back and worked an overtime shift. This grant wouldn't be possible without the assistance from the Providence Center as well. They provided the clinical support, the behavioral health expertise that was needed for this grant. And we had 3 behavioral health specialists that did work with the Providence police officers going out to try to contact and get our client population into treatments and so on. And then finally, as the research partner, we helped obviously with the evaluation, deciding the sample size, program design. This didn't come out of the gate working smoothly. We had to sit back, think of different reiterations, change some of our strategies. And we also developed a lot of forms and tracking methods so that we could have the best data possible when we're done. So Providence is the largest city in Rhode Island, and you can see on the map where it is, about 181,000 people. It's the 3rd largest city in New England. It has the largest volume of violent crime and also the greatest number of overdoses and substance abuse treatment admissions in our state. There are also data that show that about 21% of adult Rhode Islanders report having some type of mental illness. So our goal was we had a few goals, but the overarching idea of the SPI grant in Providence was that we have a population of people that are considered high utilizers in the sense that they are constantly, EMS is constantly going to pick them up and transport them. And there's a crossover between those people and those who have contacts with the police. So our goal was to identify these high utilizers and reduce the number of contacts that they have with EMS, as well as with the Providence Police Department through arrests or any kind of violations. We wanted to do this by increasing access to comprehensive care, which was going to require some case management for these at-risk offenders. So we're looking at co-occurrences here of mental health issues as well as substance abuse issues. And we also wanted to increase law enforcement's capacity to effectively respond to these individuals. And this is a trend that, of course, we're seeing across the country now. And I also, in full disclosure, want to say that prior to this grant, Providence Police and the Providence Center did work together. There were clinicians that did ride along with officers, but this program was slightly different because we focused their attention on a special population. And the Providence Police Department and Roger Williams also have had a great relationship working together. We've worked on past grants with Project Safe Neighborhoods, reducing gun violence, and a few other items. So we do have I'm not saying there weren't maybe bumps in the beginning, but I think we're at a point where we have very good relationships with each other. So when we started a program like this, we didn't have some of the hurdles that agencies might have if they were working together for the first time. So I kind of already talked about the first one, but Jackie was going to speak a little bit about the pre-existing relationship versus what we were doing now.
Yep. Hi. Thanks, Steph. So the Providence Center and the Providence Police Department actually began working together in 2010. We were very fortunate to have a police department in Providence that was so inviting and welcoming to the behavioral health community of professionals. And to the point that they actually welcomed us in, they gave us radios, they gave us access to their building, they let us ride around in their uniform patrol division. And the goal of the partnership right from the beginning was all the things that Stephanie just talked about. Really diversion away from criminal justice. If, the reason that they were having contact is because of behavioral health issue, as well as diversion away from unnecessary hospitalizations. So this program was sort of a metamorphosis of that, in that we targeted the highest utilizers in the city of not only police calls for service, EMS calls for service, but also utilization of social service. And so we targeted folks in a more proactive way than we had in the past by conducting aggressive community outreach, trying to target specific individuals wherever they may be within our community, locating them day by day to aggressively offer them services as a means of avoiding crisis encounters.
Thank you, Jackie. So how did we get to our client list? This is the type of a program where we struggled at first with how many people should we be looking at in terms of how many people can we provide the services to and keep in touch with them enough to possibly see some type of effect of the important work that was being done. And we aimed high at first, and then we realized that because there were so many co-occurrences and this is a very needy population, that ultimately our goal was to have 20 active clients at a time. So some would come in, some would come out, whether they decided, we couldn't find them or they got help and treatment, and then somebody else would be added in. So we started by asking Providence EMS to provide us with a list of their top 100 highest utilizers for 2016, 2017, and 2018. And then our Officer DeCecco matched them against the Providence Police Department system to see who of those 100 also had frequent contacts with the Providence Police Department. So our initial list actually was 65 people, but there were various reasons why out of that 65, people ended up being dropped. So for example, we had a certain number on that list of 65 that we couldn't locate. There were some that had been incarcerated, so they're not going to be included. And some didn't have any recent police contact. They may have had contact on the earlier end of 2016, but come 2018, no contact. So we took them off of this potential client list. And from there, the teams went out with their list, and I will let them explain what actually took place during the client interactions. Jackie?
So the role of the clinician was mainly first to determine whether or not the reason for police or EMS contact was the result of a behavioral health issue. So once contact was established, we would conduct a brief field assessment to screen for psychiatric symptoms or symptoms of substance abuse that might qualify them. And then from there, we would offer them enrollment into the program. It was voluntary participation. What we found was that a good amount of people did, in fact, agree to participate, but also a good amount never signed the enrollment forms or the consents to treat, though they continued to accept services whenever they would see us in the community. And then there was another smaller subset that completely refused to interact with us at all. And for the client population that engaged with us either formally or informally, we would provide them a variety of social services, connecting them to case management, therapy, psychiatry, substance abuse treatment of various intensities, helping them sort of liaise to a variety of community agencies, whether it be the Providence Center or other various partners that we work with in the city.
At the onset of this program, it was interesting to note that, you know, we had to select officers who were not zoned in on the traditional policing model, where it's arrest orientated, and the primary goal was to contact these people with services for the long term. So when we made our selections for the team, that we kept that in mind. And then when we got together with the clinicians, it was a little interesting to have to establish a relationship and a trusting relationship between the officers and the clinicians, because it's been stated by the other jurisdictions that a lot of times their goals are different. You know, police are emergency oriented, want to solve the problem right away. So you have to understand that the role is different, and that, again, you can't arrest your way out of addiction and mental health issues. You know, you have to contact to further the services for the clients. So with that in mind, you know, doing outreach with the clinician in the car was very interesting. When we contacted clients, we had to understand our roles. And a lot of times we would give in to each other, but for the most part, when the clinician was engaging with the client, you know, sometimes the officer had to step back because there might have been some HIPAA violation or some kind of trust issue also with the officers. So, you know, we had to do that balancing act where we could step back and let the clinician have some privacy, but also provide security, because sometimes these things do turn for the worse. So anyway, you know, that was interesting. I just wanted to know of our original list, whether we could find somebody or somebody stayed into the program with us. We did lose 4 or 5 of our original list to death. So whether it was an overdose, we had one person murdered, one person run over by a car while they were inebriated. So that was kind of an interesting dynamic to, you know, some of the people on our list.
Thank you, Paul. We also created several different forms that we would happily make available to anyone who would like to use them as a jumping off board. Because our sample size is so small, our final report is going to end up being more you know, qualitative than quantitative. So we were very interested in tracking just about every behavior of our team and of our clients. So we have reports that we asked the officers when they were working their overtime shifts to fill out and get at, you know, what time of day were you out there? Because originally we had officers going out in the afternoon, and the team was finding out that late afternoon was a little too late because some of the clients that they were trying to engage with were already too far inebriated and wouldn't be able to consent, and you know, might try to avoid the team. So we wanted notations on what the officers and clinicians were doing on the individual shifts when the officers. We also have a form on notable client outcomes. So we were looking for ways to document these key milestones that the clients in the program were meeting. So any getting them into treatment, having them stay in treatment, having them take their medication, finding them a place to live. Those were all significant things that we wanted to track for each of our clients. And I mean, we have forms that ask questions for the team to fill out. When was the original date that you contacted the client? Did they immediately come into the program? Did they seem hesitant at first? When you went and did a follow-up, were they belligerent? Or did they actually want to come into the program and work with the team? So a lot of very interesting variables. And these forms ended up being reworked many times, because when we would have our meetings, the team would come back and say, well, we ran into this. It's how do we document this on the form? So we would be creating different iterations of the documentation. And beyond the forms that we have collected for the actual interactions of the team with the clients, we've also done interviews with all of the members of the team to see what they would change if they were, starting this at another police department, the recommendations the officers and clinicians would make as to who are the right type of people to bring onto this type of program. And we're also in the final stages of completing a survey where we asked all of the members of the Providence Police Department their opinions on these types of partnerships, if they were aware that this partnership was in place, if they've ever called on a member of this team for assistance or to direct them to a client that maybe they were looking for. We were trying to gauge their interest in having more training for officers. And again, being very careful of making it clear that we're not asking these questions because we think police officers need to be replaced. But just that there can be a better understanding so that, as Paul mentioned, we're not just trying to arrest out of an addiction when we know that that strategy doesn't tend to work very well. So some of the outcomes and successes and realities, the team realized that these clients are difficult to find, right? Many of them are homeless, or the address on record is not where they actually live. And depending on what time of the day you get to them, they may not be fully engaged. And so we had some who came into the program and then couldn't find them again. And in that case, they would be replaced with the next person on our list, because we had our list of replacements. So it is difficult to keep this population engaged. And so you have to have people on your team that are willing to keep going back out there, even if they're not finding the clients they want to get the job done. We had to reimagine what success looks like. We would love to have everybody have their mental illness and drug addictions and alcohol addictions cured. Our definition of success wasn't sure. We would love to have someone being off the streets and completely clean, but we recognized that that wasn't going to be the goal that we had for everyone, right? So success here means, did we get the person a place to live? Maybe all of their issues weren't addressed, but some of them were, okay? And this is a project that really needs to be individualized. A success for me is not going to be the same as a success for another person. Getting me to take my medication on a daily basis can be a success, because that means I'm not doing things that require EMS or the police to come and check on me. From the reports that we have, we can see that most of the clients did show support for the efforts. Sometimes, overall, sometimes, they would say they were interested, but when you got to the point of trying to actually engage them or get them into a program, there was some hesitation. But the team really worked well, you know, going back and talking to people again and again. They weren't harassing them or stalking them or anything like that. They were just, they would see them, hey, what do you think? You thinking about coming into the program? These are the resources we can provide. And ultimately, we ended up with 40 different clients over the time of the grant. And among those 40 clients, there were over 700 interactions between our team and those clients. And Jackie was going to share some success stories.
Thanks. So really briefly, you know, we had a very high profile case, a woman with a long history of trauma, significant alcohol use issues, homeless, insecurity. And she was frequently having contact with police because she was publicly intoxicated. She was a nuisance. She made it difficult for local businesses to operate uninterrupted. She had frequent runs to the hospital, so EMS was pretty frequently transporting her. She was kind of one of those mascots, you know, the people that's always downtown, kind of disrupting things. And so she was somebody that obviously we targeted. And when we first started, she was not medication compliant. She would never come into, you know, the outpatient service provider to seek services or to participate in treatment. And through this SPI program and the aggressive, very frequent outreach attempts, we got her to develop enough of a relationship with the team that she began to trust us and started to stay in a homeless shelter. And we got her an apartment. There's a sort of a unique situation in the shelter system where it's, you know, traditional shelter, but also they have a separate section of individual apartments. And so she was assigned one of those, but because of her trauma, was not comfortable to stay in it. And so although she had housing at this point, it was still disruptive. But again, working with her using a variety of therapeutic techniques, we got her to stay in her apartment for 5 minutes at a time, 10 minutes at a time. And so, you know, flash forward several years and many contact hours later, she's receiving a long-acting injectable antipsychotic medication pretty consistently. She's engaging with medical providers, psychiatric providers. She stays in her apartment, is no longer a nuisance to the downtown area. Businesses are no longer calling to complain about her, and she's not inappropriately accessing hospital care. So this is definitely probably one of our greatest successes and a testament to the fact that this type of partnership can very much work.
One addendum to that success story is that not only all the things you said are true, her son, who was estranged from her life, is now in her life and visiting her in her apartment and is able to keep his relationship with her now. I also have another success story that I wanted to share. We had a 59-year-old homeless man who was a daily drinker of alcohol in one of the sections of the city. Same thing, frequent nuisance to the businesses, was living on a park bench there. In one calendar year, he was transported via rescue to the hospital 59 times. And like the other ones, you know, we outreached him several times, and he was resistant at first. Through, you know, constant outreach and getting to know him and establishing a rapport and some trust, he was eventually placed in a long-term care facility where he no longer drinks. He had serious medical issues with being able to walk and his eyesight, which were also able to be taken care of in this facility. So he went from, you know, being transported 59 times a year to now not having any contact with the police. And, you know, that is the goal of the program, right? To get the person to help and to reduce their reliability on public safety services. So that was a good outcome.
So there's certainly a difference between partnering on 911 emergency type calls and the more long-term case management efforts that we embarked upon with this SPI project. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the history of our partnership really began with the emergency type crisis calls. And I think what this program has highlighted is that really what we need is a model that supports a dual approach, a direct response model where we have a behavioral health expertise responding out independently of police officers to take some of these social service type challenges off the shoulders of our law enforcement public safety community when it's safe to do so. And we still need a co-response model that embeds clinicians and other levels of service provider with police officers, because the fact of the matter is that some of these calls, as the sergeant mentioned, can go very sideways very quickly, and it's hard to know when. And we need to be able to kind of share resources back and forth. The other reason that there's really two distinct pathways here is because the mental health laws, at least in Rhode Island, treat health information privacy very differently in those two prongs of approach. So if we can justify that there's a crisis happening, there's an emergency occurring, the information sharing between healthcare provider and police officer is much freer. We're able to discuss the case, discuss what's happening, and make sure that we can get that person to safety. But in some of these other, low speed chronic type calls, which was the main target of this SPI project, there's really no crisis unfolding. We're talking about chronic risk in those cases. And so the HIPAA laws in 42 CFR, which is a little more restrictive around substance abuse information, kicks back in, and it gets very challenging for us to share information freely unless the client consents. And what we found is that most clients were not willing to consent. And so the solution there has been for police officers to use police identified data, crime analytics, to make introductions to folks they recognized could be in need of social supports. Introduce us to those clients and allow the client the opportunity to engage with us that way. And at that point, the officers were great about stepping back into the periphery and allowing us to have a more private, more healthcare centered conversation where we could work on establishing trust, encourage the sharing of information, and sort of, rebrand the police department as helpers versus just strictly law enforcers. And we had a lot of success in doing so in a lot of cases. And what we found, ironically, is that more than a few times, clients were much more willing to speak with police officers than they were with clinicians. And so that was kind of a fun learning moment for us.
So obviously today we keep on hearing about trust. And one of the major issues that we came across was COVID. A lot of the clients that we were able to engage with, the main reason was they were able to trust us, and we gained that trustful relationship with them. But once COVID hit, everything stopped. The outreach stopped. We couldn't go out. We weren't allowed to go out due to the circumstances of COVID. And we touched upon several success stories. And one of them, we had an individual, high utilizer, had a lot of substance abuse problems. One night we were able to take him to the hospital. He consented to go to the hospital, and come to find out he had a severe case of infection on his foot. Essentially what we ended up doing was we actually saved his life that night because he was going to die from that infection. We were able to engage him into all the services. We were checking up on him. He was doing really, really well for himself. But due to the fact of COVID, we weren't allowed into the treatment facility. A lot stopped. And as soon as we were able to bring back the program, we had to regain his trust, because essentially in his mind, he thought we just abandoned him again. And we saw a lot of regression during that time with not just this individual client, but with several clients. Just the daily interactions that we were having with them, whether they were successful or not, a lot of them looked forward to seeing us and just allowing us to say hi every day, and to gain that trust back. It was a lot more difficult because they just felt abandoned once again. I know Jackie had touched upon it earlier. the cultural differences between police and social workers or clinicians. And I know Sacramento touched upon it also. We do. We have differences. Obviously, law enforcement, we want to solve the problem immediately. And we just tend to, sometimes we butt heads. But what I did find is in our program, a lot of times we're able to just sit there, communicate, talk it out, and see how can we make this work? What can we do? Is this a police matter or is this a clinical matter? But once we got these issues worked out, we did move forward. And I feel that the work and partnership between the officers and the clinicians and social workers ended up being very, very positive.
Thank you, Mark. So I'll just wrap us up by saying that our clients, complicated individuals, complicated issues, and we did confirm back when we started this grant that a small sample size would be acceptable to the funding agencies. And you need to keep these types of programs small in size so everyone involved can so everyone involved can be engaged in meaningful work and that we can hopefully get meaningful outcomes for our clients. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you to the Providence team and to all three of our SPI teams who gave us this really critical insight to an area that's so important for policing today. I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of issues that I think were key to everything we heard today. One of those is the importance of policing really moving to a service orientation, because all departments are dealing with these high utilizers that we heard about, and the amount of time it takes to deal with calls for people in crisis. Nothing could be more important than to taking this service orientation to deal with this important area. Collaboration is key, not only collaborating and communicating and working with the service providers in the agency or in your community, but having officers working with public health providers or community health workers or social workers is just beneficial to both, because I think they grow in their job. That's what I heard. And I think that's a really important thing to take away from this, is how much officers can benefit from having that exposure to social workers and vice versa as well. And third, the one thing I heard that I really picked up on is how this approach can increase officer satisfaction, because they can see results and positive impact on individuals, and that can even increase a positive feel for their jobs. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. We really appreciate your participation in this webinar. We hope you've learned, and you are welcome to contact any of our presenters to learn more. And we hope you move in this direction. Thank you so much and have a great day.